Well, hello everyone. Thanks, Kristen. Well, I'm really excited to be here today. So, as Kristen mentioned, I work at BuzzFeed. We are a digital news and entertainment company, and at BuzzFeed, I manage a team of designers that work on our mobile apps there. So, if any of you are familiar with BuzzFeed, you might know that data plays a very integral role in how we function as a company and as a publication. And I think so later today, you're going to hear a little bit about romance. And I kind of want to challenge the notion that data and romance are mutually exclusive. I think that data gets a reputation for being very cold, calculating, unfeeling, but really data is just a means to an end. It's information, and what matters is how you use that information. And so today I'm going to give you 3 ideas on how to do that. The first is data for activism, and the second is data for user experience, and then we're going to end on data for authenticity, which kind of relates to journalism. So let's get started with activism. So first of all, I think we have to acknowledge that as humans, we all have biases. We view the world very subjectively in relation to ourselves. And most of the time, this is a very good thing. This is what makes us unique and what makes us individuals. But the bad thing about it is that sometimes it can blind us from understanding the experiences of people who are not like us. And it's what allows many people to rationalize that discrimination doesn't exist because they don't experience it themselves. And I think that in this way, data can be very useful and important. It can be used as an objective source of truth and a way of it can make us aware of systemic inequality and also hold us accountable to solving these problems. So an example that I want to talk about, back in 2013, Tracy Chow, she's an early engineer at Pinterest, and she put out a public call for tech companies to release public stats and data on the ratio of male to female engineers that they employ. So on the right is the spreadsheet which is open source. You can view it on GitHub. You can add to it and contribute to it if you want. On the left is a visualization that another designer made out of that open source data. So as of last week, there are over 200 companies that have submitted data to this spreadsheet. And out of them, only 14 of them actually exceed a 50% ratio of men to women. Most of them average out at around 18% female engineers. And up until this data was collected and made public for everyone to see, oftentimes complaints about discrimination in the workplace for tech companies were dismissed. People thought, oh, this is just your individual problem. It only pertains to you, or maybe where you work, maybe get a new job. But once we actually see this data in aggregate, we're more aware that this is actually an industry-wide trend. And I think that data is crucial because this type of inequality, the systemic type, the kind that results in disproportionate incarceration rates for Black men in America or inequitable wage gaps between genders, problems of this scale can't be solved by good intentions alone. They require changes in policy, which require data to back them up. And it's also important because these are all very sensitive issues to point out that when we use data to affect social change, it doesn't have to just be about presenting numbers. A lot of times, it's actually the pairing of statistics with an emotional appeal that's more effective in communicating not just the problems, but inspiring people to take action. So an example of this is this visualization on the death toll in the Iraq War by the South China Morning Post. So you see there are very intentional design decisions being made here to provoke the viewer into having some sort of feeling about the information that they're seeing. This is another example. It's a campaign called Meet the World by a designer in Brazil named Icaro Doria. And basically what he's doing is he's taking statistics from a specific country and approximating those ratios to the proportions of colors used in that country's flag. So this one's about Burkina Faso and the child life expectancy there. And this campaign attempts to kind of be subversive by juxtaposing something we have a lot of pride in, such as nationalism, our country's flag, with something that we're ashamed of. And the hope is to sort of inspire the viewer to take action because they're so uncomfortable at this association. So here's another one from the series about Brazil and the poverty level there. I think that when we're talking about approximating and the impact that visuals have on our interpretation of data, I kind of want to point out that information can so easily be manipulated. Even though numbers themselves are objective, the way that they are paired and work in relation to each other can change someone's interpretation and paint an entirely different picture. So I think anyone working with data, especially using it for activism or for social change, has an ethical imperative to be very thorough in considering how they're visualizing data, and also what metrics they're even measuring in the first place. And a good example of that, going back to Tracy Chow from Pinterest, when she first published the call to collect public data on diversity stats, she warned us about focusing too much on vanity metrics. So she warns us that pointing to happy numbers, such as those on conference attendance, doesn't do anything except make people feel good, while the real issues fester unaddressed. And since her call, many companies have publicly posted their diversity stats in all these very colorful pie graphs. We've heard from Facebook, Google, Apple, Yahoo. We also released our stats at BuzzFeed. And in thinking about this, something that, even though this is a huge step forward, it feels like a lot of crucial information is missing, and it's a little misleading in a way. For example, we don't know what the attrition rates are for women engineers at any of these companies. Like, we don't know how many women are leaving, even though there are a lot of public statistics already out there, such as a study from Harvard Business School that says that 56% of women will leave the tech industry after about 10 years in it. And I think it's really interesting that most of those public stats that companies put out focus so much on hiring and current employment, when attracting talent is a very different problem from retaining it. But still, I think that data is very valuable in working towards inclusion and social change. If nothing else, it starts the conversation by inspiring us to ask for more information. It allows us to identify trends, set benchmarks and realistic goals, and then holds us accountable to actually working towards those goals. Cool. So I talked a little bit about how design can influence our interpretation of data, and now I kind of want to segue, flip it around, and talk about how we use data to inform design decisions at BuzzFeed. So I actually have to admit that as a designer, in the past, I've had a more antagonistic relationship with data. I think that's largely because I've worked at places where growth hacking was a really big thing. How many of you guys are familiar with that term, hacking? Well, okay, a few people. What about dark patterns or UX anti-patterns? Okay. So for anyone who doesn't know, a dark pattern is basically a design decision that misleads users into taking an undesired action, even though it might be something that's really good for the company. So this is like a really good example of this. This is from Netflix, and it's this modal that comes up and asks you to connect to Facebook. And you might notice that there's no visible button to not connect to Facebook. It's the only option on this entire modal. And when I first saw this, I spent like 5 minutes trying out, how do I avoid this? I really don't want to do this. And if you look very closely in the top right corner, there's a little X button. It turns out that the background is actually the banner itself, but they've designed it to look like this is your only option. Oops, sorry, go back. But this was from like maybe 2 years ago. They have updated it since then, so don't worry, like we're in a better place now, Netflix. But it's a really good example of a dark UX pattern. And the thing is, I'm sure that if you look at the data there, they're probably like, wow, more people are connecting with Facebook. This works great. But if you actually look at what people are saying and looking at qualitative feedback, it also paints a different picture. So I used to work at a payments company called Venmo. It's an app where you can basically transfer money to your friends. And when I first started, we were doing something very similar. We basically had a button that said, invite my entire address book to this app, and we put it where you would typically have a skip button or a next button. So naturally, a lot of people hit this button. And it looked, if you actually looked at the amount of invites sent, it like skyrocketed, and everyone was so happy. But if you actually looked at how many of those invites converted to signups or downloads, they did not convert at all. And so we were kind of like looking through some more qualitative feedback because we kept getting we kept noticing that there were tons of tweets about Venmo and spam all together in one sentence. And basically, like, people were really mad about this. And I think like that's a huge reason why it didn't convert, because none of those invites were actually sent intentionally. None of them actually wanted to share this app. So yeah. And so at BuzzFeed, we do use data for like small decisions like conversion and things like that. But I've actually found it more useful when we use data to identify opportunities for strategic design decisions, or as an imperative to improve our existing user experience. So one really interesting fact about BuzzFeed is that people who use the native app read 3 times as many posts as the average BuzzFeed user who might come in through Facebook or through some other channel. And they also share proportionally more because they're reading more. Sorry. So this here, at the bottom here is the footer that appears on every post. This is what it looked like about a year ago. You can react, you can leave a comment, you can share it through Facebook or email. And we decided to visually redesign this a year ago, and we're like, well, if we're going to touch it anyway, let's just like pull some data, see how things are looking. Maybe there's an opportunity to do more. And, unsurprisingly, we found that Facebook is our top share and followed by email. So the current design reflects this. But what we also found from digging deeper is that the average individual person doesn't share to more than 2 social networks. So if someone was sharing through SMS or Pinterest, which you would have to tap into the system dialog in the bottom right to access, it was actually very unlikely that they would ever use the Facebook or email icons here. So we're kind of missing out on an opportunity to prompt them to share and also making them do extra work to share. So when we redesigned the footer, what we did was we actually started tracking what users were sharing through the system dialog. And basically the footer keeps track of your preferences, so it always reflects the top 2 options that you share from. So this is mine. This is like my screenshot from my app. So I share a lot through Facebook Messenger and through copying the link because I like to do things the hard way for some reason. And it's really cool because I see different screenshots from people tweeting and I'm like, oh wow, like they're that kind of person, like they're that type of sharer. And this was kind of validated from user testing when we talked to people, and people have very strong opinions on where they share to. And a lot of people have this mental model of broadcasting versus sending. And sending is more one-on-one sharing, which people tend to feel more comfortable with. So basically through this, like we're still prompting users to share, and we're able to create a more personalized experience for those people who would never broadcast what they're sharing. And what we found since rolling this out is that those share rates for some of the less popular options like SMS, Twitter, Pinterest have gone up slightly since rolling this out, which has contributed to our overall share count for the app. Well, another thing we're thinking about a lot at BuzzFeed is push notifications. So something that's sort of been a trend lately is the idea that the news feed or the notification feed is a news feed in and of itself. So there's 2 apps that are sort of experimented in this vein, Yo and Ping. And both of these explore the idea of an app as nothing more than a mechanism to manage your notifications. So you can subscribe to specific topics with Ping and get notifications, or with Yo, it's basically just a beeper. All you do is push a button and it just tells someone that you yo'd them. It's very strange. But like I said, experimental apps. So something else we know about push notifications at BuzzFeed from our BuzzFeed app is that users that do opt into push notifications are more likely to become active and returning users. But very often, push notifications can be very spammy. They can be dark UX patterns in and of themselves. But keeping in mind that one size doesn't fit all, we recently launched a BuzzFeed News app back in June, which you can see here on my right. And when we launched it, basically a part of the app has this alert stream where you can subscribe to different categories of push notifications. And not only are the categories more topical like technology or world news, we also have temporary topics for specific events that are going on in the world right now. So the FIFA corruption scandal was one of them. The shooting in Charleston, South Carolina was another. And this actually kind of matches the way that we heard users actually want to receive push notifications, which is very specific, and they want to be updated on stories they've already expressed that they're interested in. And a really cool example of this in action was, so recently the US Supreme Court ruled in favor of marriage equality. I know this is something that you guys were way ahead of us on in Sweden, but it's very exciting when it happened in the US. And we sent a push notification, so anyone who was subscribed to LGBT news or breaking news in general received this push. And what you can see is the impact that had on retention in the news app. So the graph down here at the bottom, that huge peak is when we push the notification itself. And while that huge peak is cool, that's actually not what we were that excited about or paying attention to. What we were looking at was after the peak came down, the baseline was still higher than before the push was sent. So overall, more people were in our app the day of the push notification after we sent it out because they were getting pulled back into the app and then reading more articles after the notification. And aside from just the quantitative feedback, we've gotten a lot of good qualitative feedback about the app itself. So this is someone just telling us, like, that because of our notification, that's how they found out about the decision. We were the first to notify them, and they spread the word by showing their friends. And it's something that we feel very strongly about at BuzzFeed, is that we just want to deliver the news and inform people. Whether that happens through an entire post or just through a push notification, it feels like a win to us. Of course, it brings some interesting questions for me, which is, how do you track that? Like, how do you know if someone actually read that notification or if they got any value out of it? I don't have an answer to that, but it's something we're thinking about. And it excites me as a designer because I feel like I have to kind of work backwards and figure out, okay, like, how do you interpret actions into intent if someone's just reading something? So something that I've learned from working on both of these apps is to basically stop looking at data only as a vehicle for A/B tests or identifying a winner, and to start using it on a more personal level to personalize the app for the users. Cool. And the last thing that I'm going to talk about a little bit here is how data is changing the face of journalism and the way media companies operate. So prior to the rise of the internet and social media, whatever you read in a physical paper or whatever you saw on the front page of a newspaper was often determined by a very select group of writers and editors. They decided what was important and what you should care about. And the thing is that many newsrooms tend to be fairly homogenous, so what they think you should care about has the potential to be skewed towards the demographics of the writers themselves. It's what they care about. But social media has provided a really interesting new channel for people to break through that. When enough people, everyday people, are making noise about a certain topic, news organizations have no choice but to pay attention to them. So it's basically democratizing journalism, which is good and bad, because sometimes popular opinion isn't always in the best interest of the actual public. I mean, for example, Donald Trump is trending very highly right now in the US. So, but on the flip side, it can be used for good. It can highlight voices that we don't usually hear from. So kind of going back to women in tech, there was this hashtag that went around last week, I look like an engineer. It's a hashtag that started on Twitter. It started with a self-published Medium post, and it went so viral that basically news organizations from around the world had no choice but to write about it. Otherwise, you would be missing out. So there are a lot. Cool. So in this way, I think that the benefit of being reactive as a media organization is that you can often draw attention and place emphasis on first-hand accounts, like protesters or activists who are on the ground in a certain country, over a second-hand interpretation of that same story. And in this way, the modern media company can act as a megaphone for marginalized voices. So I was talking to one of my colleagues on the editorial team at BuzzFeed about this conference, and I talked about how the prompt was sort of methods of getting through the noise, and she said something really interesting to me, which was, well, sometimes the noise is just more interesting. And as an example, she started talking to me about Ferguson. So hopefully, I'm not sure how many people know, but Ferguson is a town that's sort of been at the center of a lot of racial tensions in the United States after a police officer shot an unarmed teenager there. So there's been protests. And if you were to click into the Ferguson hashtag on Twitter during the height of all that action, or even a week ago on the anniversary, you would see a lot of stuff that looks like this here on the right. And I think it's fair to say that this could be noise. Like, it's a little overwhelming if you just have a feed of information like this. But the thing is that if your voice isn't being heard, sometimes you have to make noise in order to send a signal in the first place. And that's basically what happened with Ferguson. Once it started trending on Twitter, media companies began to pick it up. But I think what we're noticing is that the delay between identifying that signal is getting more noticeable to our audiences. So for example, for Ferguson, most people found out about this through Twitter, through tweets like this. In fact, it wasn't until 2 days after the shooting, on the second day of protest, that any American media company actually dedicated any airtime to this issue. So a lot of people felt like they were very late to address it. And I think that beyond just the ethical imperative of covering important stories like this, if you're not willing to actually dig through the noise yourself, then you're not going to break any news, which is very important. And at BuzzFeed, another signal that we pay a lot of attention to and is starting to become a really big thing for us is international traffic for posts that are gaining popularity. Because every time we translate a post into a new language, we're reaching a new audience that we would not have otherwise ever been able to reach. And so this is an example of a story that was about a women's rights protest in Argentina. It was originally published in Spanish. And what we noticed was that it started getting a lot of traffic in the US. So we translated it into English. And we noticed from that English translation that this post started making inroads in France. So we translated it again into French. And that's where, for this specific story, that's sort of where the translations ended. But sometimes they go on further from France to Germany and other countries. But I think what was really specific about this post was that the topic is about feminism and women's rights. And that's something that no matter where you are in the world, it's something relatable. And so when we use data to identify how to internationalize, it's not just to identify what type of content works in what region, but to figure out what are the things that everyone cares about in the world or in this room. Cool. And so lastly, I just want to conclude on, just a reminder that data is just information and information is power. And you can use that in different ways for good or for evil. Hopefully you'll all use it for good. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah. Yeah.